Yeah, I actually didn't want to because I was a prosecutor and I thought it was all sort of BS. The students were talking about some guy they'd visited in prison. They were getting all teary-eyed and stuff. And I was like, oh, God, like this guy's totally guilty. Then DNA testing proved him innocent.
Welcome back to the Lawish Podcast. Today we have a great episode. We have a very special guest, Professor Mark Godsey. He is a professor of law at the University of Cincinnati College of Law, and he is a director and co-founder of the Ohio Innocence Project, or OIP. Both Jeff and I, you may know, were members of OIP. We were OIP fellows back when we were in law school. And we knew since the beginning of the podcast that we wanted to have OIP featured heavily in the podcast. And it just makes it the more exciting to have Professor Godsey help us essentially kick off that side of the podcast. Professor Godsey, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Obviously, this brief introduction doesn't do justice to Professor Godsey's background. So, Jeff, why don't you get us started a little bit with Professor Godsey's background, and then obviously we'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, and I don't know that I'm going to do it justice either. But so you're now an author, a professor, and a director of an Innocence Project. You know, your work since you've been doing this has had implications not just in the United States, but around the world. You know, you have a very unique background that I think is extremely interesting. And I think it allows for people who might not typically kind of, I guess, buy in, for lack of a better word, to the innocence movement to do so, because you don't have a traditional background as far as you weren't a defense attorney that went in to do innocence work. You got out of law school. You went to one of the biggest firms, Jones Day. You went from there to become a U.S. attorney in New York. It's a very prestigious job, very high-level federal prosecutor.
Award-winning.
Yes, very successful.
Not just was you prestigious, but you also were winning among the prestigious.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was a crazy job. Yeah, different life.
And you had you were obviously extremely successful, but you also had that kind of mindset that I think a lot of prosecutors have, that our justice system is, infallible, that it works, that we have the best system in the world.
You mentioned in your book, you're a prosecutor's prosecutor.
Yeah,
it's kind of like
the concept that somebody in front of us might be innocent wasn't even part of the vocabulary. Yeah, like it wasn't even in the consciousness.
Yeah,
yeah,
and that just goes with the job.
Yeah,
your job is to get bad guys in jail.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you think they wouldn't be here, right? If they weren't, if there wasn't evidence to, and certainly a jury or judge wouldn't convict them, if there wasn't something to support that.
Right.
But ultimately you decide you want to be a professor. You go to Chase College of Law. There's an opening, professor's on sabbatical, and it just so happens that you're covering an innocence clinic there.
Yeah, I actually didn't want to because I was a prosecutor and I thought it was all sort of BS. I went to the first meeting and the students were talking about some guy they'd visited in prison and how tragic it was that he was wrongfully convicted, and they were getting all teary-eyed and stuff. And I was like, oh God, like this is going to be a miserable year having to supervise this Innocence Project. This guy's totally guilty. These students are so naive.
Yeah.
Blah, 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 blah. And then DNA testing proved him innocent.
Yeah. And so then you're at this kind of crossroads where it's like, you had that mindset, a lot of prosecutors have, and you get to this where you're faced with DNA evidence that's hard to deny. It is what it is,
Yep.
And so at that point, it seems like you had kind of this awakening, in you, and you wanted to.
It wasn't even that point. It was more when he got out that I met him and started talking to him, had him speak to the class, and I was just sitting there like, oh God, I'm so ashamed of myself. It was like once his humanity was like in my presence and like hearing him telling his stories, it was just brutal.
Is that in your perspective what kind of turned that switch for you to at least start looking this other way, or like maybe broadening up your scope?
Yeah, it was that. It was the entire year, because then I went to the Innocence Conference. There's an annual conference every year where everybody who does this work and all the exonerees come together. And so then I'm just immersed with, several days of meeting these exonerees and hearing these stories and stuff. So it was like a year long. But, the very first instance of meeting an exoneree that I'd been so dismissive of when he was still in prison, and, okay, we'll apply for DNA testing. Okay, like this is not going to go anywhere. I'm thinking to myself, I'm doing like internal eye rolls at these students. And then then he's proven innocent. So it was a process over a year.
Yeah, and it seems like from in your book you talk about your book Blind Justice, like how at that point you were kind of really trying to dive into how this happens, how this could happen, how an innocent person could go to jail, like what factors ultimately kind of led to this occurring. And really, a lot of your book is based around that. It's trying to not only present a lot of the psychological things that are at play underlying wrongful convictions, why there's so much resistance, all the different factors that are at play, but also presenting in a way that's easy to digest and understand for your, just everyday reader or
right.
listener. And I think what's so great about what you do in the book specifically is you tie in specific experiences that you had as a prosecutor to explain these, the factors and the different things that are going on in a way where it's not just, you're getting like, you're just reading text and you're like, okay, well, this is, say it's something like tunnel vision or something like that, but you're actually tying in how it works and giving an example that people can understand. And it allows, I know for me reading the book, it allowed it to really hit in a much different way. And it made it a lot harder to just kind of gloss over. So
thank you.
Yeah, I think how you did this book, and again, your background being unique in the sense that you were a prosecutor who is now doing innocence work is something that's just, it's amazing. And it's I think inspiring for a lot of people and just really eye-opening. So, I mean, it's great. Now you're seeing, you're running the Innocence Project. You've freed 37 people now, is that correct?
36.
36.
Yeah, there's a couple close cases that I wouldn't be surprised if in the next 6 months we free 2 or 3 more people.
Yeah,
there's several close cases right now,
and that's just the start of it. I mean, you're bringing so much awareness to this, and again, not even just in the States, but you've been all over the world, presenting.
Yeah, I mean, what we realized is that, and this wasn't obvious at first, but the things that cause wrongful convictions are human failings. It's not the system, so it doesn't matter if you're in Iran or China or the United States or Brazil. They might have different procedures that they use, but prosecutors, human beings, act the same way when they get power, whether they're in the U.S. or they're in Brazil.
Right.
Eyewitnesses have the same flaws in their human memory, whether they're in China or whether they're in the Netherlands. And the U.S. has exported its flawed forensics. It's the same problems that we have here with forensics. Everybody's adopted it all around the world. So it's all the same types of evidence, the same types of mistakes. And so we can all learn from each other. And I mean, the problem of wrongful convictions is going on everywhere because everybody uses the same type of flawed evidence.
The way you present it in your book, I think, is also really, it gives you more legitimacy, I guess, to the reader as far as you're not saying all prosecutors are bad or all defense attorneys. You say everybody basically can make these mistakes because we're all human. And we all suffer from the same biases, the same factors are at play, whether you're the judge, you're the prosecutor, you're an eyewitness, whatever the situation may be. And so I think that it allows for more buy-in from people that might not normally, want to believe that this happens. So yeah, it's a tremendous honor to have you here. We're glad to have you on the podcast.
And I think, obviously the three of us, we just dove right in. But for our listeners who may not know what we're talking about, they're lost right now. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what OIP is and what the work OIP does in general, and then we'll dive right back into some of these questions.
Yeah, so OIP it's what you call a clinic at a law school, at UC Law School. And inmates in Ohio, people who have been convicted or in prison, who claim they're innocent, will write into us. And the students start investigating their cases. So it's a reinvestigation. A lot of these people have been in for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And a certain percentage, it's a small percentage, but the investigation is able to determine that they actually are innocent and were wrongfully convicted. And so at that point, we litigate to get them freed. Of all the people that have written to us, and I think it's over like 12,000 since we started in 2003, obviously a lot of them we probably believe are guilty. When you look into the case, it looks like they're guilty, and it shouldn't be a surprise that some guilty person might try anyway, right?
Yeah,
take advantage of a nonprofit. That's just part of what is part of the business of our work. There's a small percentage that we're able to get far enough to prove they're actually innocent, but there's a lot more who they could be innocent, but like the evidence has been destroyed or the witnesses are dead. They, there's no DNA to test. And so you really have to be lucky to be one of those that can make it like to the end of the assembly line where everything is in place and all the coincidences line up where we can actually show that you're innocent. And so, we've freed 36 now on grounds of innocence, and including somebody who spent 46 years in prison for murder they didn't commit. We're also involved in, as you mentioned, spreading awareness. So we now have what's called OIPU. It's the U is like ESPNU, like undergrad.
Okay.
So there's 12 chapters at different colleges around Ohio. They're like college clubs, and they their job is to like spread awareness on the college campus. So they have events and speakers and demonstrations and different things like that. And it's been really effective. Pierce Reed in our office, who's somebody you should have on at some point, is the one who runs that along with legislation, which is the last part. So we're introducing legislation, trying to improve the system and cut down on wrongful convictions in the first place. Yeah. So we have a presence always in the State House as well.
That's incredible. I mean, for me, I did not know what the Innocence Movement was, or OIP was, until I went to UC Law as a student. And but people were like, "Oh, OIP is such a big deal. It's great." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah." And then I had to like figure out what it was.
Yeah.
And so having this outreach program set up with OIPU, I think is great, because then there's been maybe some forays into like Netflix Making a Murder, where you get some glances into the innocence movement in general. But I think for the everyday average Joe and Jane, I think having this outreach program is great, because it kind of brings into the spotlight the work that you're doing.
I mean, that's the key. The awareness to any movement is the key.
Yeah.
So we can fight in court and we can file these briefs. Nobody reads the briefs. I mean, it only has limited impact. I mean, you look at the people who for decades have been fighting for, I'm trying to remember the name of it, like Lambda, which I think is the legal organization like the ACLU that fights for LGBTQ rights. And these lawyers who are in court trying to win these cases, and they're litigating and blah, 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 blah. But then one show like Will and Grace comes along, and it has more of an impact on changing our culture, or Ellen DeGeneres. So spreading awareness and having things like that are far more important than like what we're doing on the ground.
Yeah.
And so that's why we're doing everything we can to get awareness out there.
And hopefully us doing this as well will help a little bit, pitch in a little bit, and put our 2 cents to help with the spreading of awareness as well. So you talked about the OIP as a clinic and how it works. Again, to me, it was a little bit different than what you normally think an organization like this would work. You have a setup where the common denominators are you as a director and the staff attorneys, the supervising attorneys, but you have students that come in, for 1 year and a half, or a year in the summer, and work on these cases. The objective is to get these cases moved, a little bit further every single time, to get the case, leave it better than you found it, and kind of move the ball a little bit further. Can you talk a little bit about maybe what the frustrations or the benefits are of having a system like this? You get a set of fresh eyes, but you also get a set of fresh eyes, right? So,
yeah, well, I think it's mostly a benefit. So there's innocence projects all over the country, and in fact the world now, and a lot of the other innocence projects in the U.S. operate on a semester basis. So the students are there for a semester, and I think one of the reasons that we've been so successful compared to other innocence projects is that we have them for a year. Because it takes about a semester for the students to even learn their cases, and then they're done. Yeah. And then I sit there and I think, like, I don't even know how you guys operate when you're flipping students every semester.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, we set it up where the students work full time over the summer, so we have their undivided attention from 9 to 5 all summer long, and then they're really competent at handling their cases by the time the school year starts, and then they work the following school year. It's definitely a plus because. If I am ever need an attorney, you don't want to get somebody 1 year out of law school, but I'm never going to hire somebody who's like 25, 30 years out of law school either. I like the sweet spot. The best attorneys, in my opinion, are like 10, 11, 12 years out of law school, where they still are trying to prove themselves and they're not jaded yet or resting on their laurels. And I've had attorneys who are out there for 30 years and they have these great names and they absolutely stink. And so there's a little bit of that going on, and that you have these students who are really energized, they're not jaded. I think they actually work harder than attorneys do. Most of them, not all of them, but so to me, it's the youth is only a plus, and it keeps in any job like this. It's hard for us attorneys that are doing the work because you're just pounding your head up against a brick wall, a system that doesn't want to move.
Yeah.
And that can be like we have burnout in this field, and like people can only do it for a few years sometimes, and then they leave because they're so frustrated. But having the enthusiasm and the idealism of students is like it helps the entire organization.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we felt. From our end, there was a little bit of frustration because we wanted to do more, but then you also get that glimmer of hope where you're like, okay, we have now the new fellows coming in, and there's a transition process where we're handing off our cases and writing these closing memos for what we did, what we found it, what you think you should do, and then just seeing them then kind of pick the baton and keep running it. That's always
it's surprising. People probably wouldn't understand why the cases take so long, but I mean, if you're looking at a case that's 20, 30 years old, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 years for us just to get all the documents.
Yeah.
Right. We're spending a lot of time where the students are just sort of like fighting with the police department trying to get the complete file.
Right.
Or there's one key witness that nobody can find, and you sort of like don't close the case because every year you sort of make another effort to try to find this person who's been out in the wind for 20 years. And sometimes you get lucky and you find the person, and sometimes after year goes by and you still can't find the person, you eventually just sort of give up.
Yeah.
But that's why, I mean, it just takes a really long time to unwind one of these cases.
Yeah, and then I think each time you get new eyes on it, the good one with benefits is then you find more stuff you want to look into, right? Mm-hmm. But with that, it makes it take even longer too, because there's other avenues to go through. And kind of along those lines, I think something that's often overlooked is, people hear OIP's exonerated 36 people. You hear that, and a lot of people might think, 36, that's not a big number, right? But I think a lot of people miss the fact that, there's two things kind of at play, but one is one person's exoneration or one person being wrongfully convicted impacts a lot more than just that individual.
Absolutely.
And do you mind touching on that just for the listener, just as far as like really the implications that a single exoneration even can have or a single wrongful conviction can have?
Well, I mean, just imagine if it picks somebody in your closest circle of friends or family that they got sent away for like a murder or a rape they had nothing to do with. And that person inside and out. And in many of our cases, the family was with the person, right? So they had an alibi, and the prosecutor said, don't believe them because that's their family members. Of course, they're going to lie for them. And so, there's not only trauma, obviously incredible trauma to the person who's wrongfully convicted, snatched away from their life and stuck in prison, but it traumatizes everybody around them, their entire families, all their friends. So it has this trickle down, the entire community. So there's a trickle down effect. Like for example, Dean Gillespie is one of our clients. When he got out, he'd been in for 20 years for a rape he didn't commit. Like 600 people came through his parents' house in the first 3 days. That's how everybody in this community, who was from a tight community, had been affected in some way. They'd been upset by this and were there to celebrate with him.
That's incredible.
Yeah. It is, and I think too, it just shows you that, a lot of these people who are wrongfully convicted, while they're in jail, their loved ones' lives become consumed by this as well. The fight to get them out, just knowing they're in there, worrying, their lives are taken from them too.
Yeah, and it's and that's one of the job hazards is that you end up as an attorney on one of these cases, like being a counselor for their family because they've had this burden for so long. They're trying to fight for their loved one, and then the Innocence Project takes over, and it's sort of a relief for them in some ways. And we've had situations where after we take over a case, the family will say this is the first time since he was arrested that we've enjoyed Christmas, that we actually laughed at Christmas because the burden's not on us anymore. Yeah. But at the same time, I've had situations where the family is so traumatized that every time you call them to give them an update, they just want to naturally just sort of dump all this on you.
Yeah.
And then it's like, well, man, I now have to lay on the floor in the fetal position and suck my thumb for a week. And I'm supposed to be working on the brief. Right. So it's hard dealing because we're just immersed in all that trauma.
Yeah.
So it's a hard balance.
I don't know if we can talk about the upcoming Spiz documentary.
Oh yeah.
So
Sure.
because you mentioned Dean Gillespie, and just to kind of put like a little cherry on top on what you just said, we were fortunate enough to go to like an early screening of it, and it should be coming out sometime soon. You can tell us when that is going to happen, but we get to witness through some of that footage how the family of Dean, like the parents, were just like you and them were just like this throughout the whole process. They feel heard, to your point, and when you show up to their house to tell them, hey, we're getting Dean out, it's just you see them on the screen, which is something hard to capture. That just be overfilling with joy. Yeah, and it just kind of speaks to your point about how we get so entrenched with the family and the community.
Yeah. And Dean's actually that what you saw is a work in progress, so it's not done yet. Right. It might be another year or so until that movie's done. But I think the filmmaker is Barry Rowan. He's done a tremendous job with it. Can't wait to see how it ends up.
Yeah, it was incredible, and
it definitely it shows the humanity that's involved in the sacrifices across the board. And anytime even a single person, which it shouldn't. You hear, one person was exonerated. Like, that should be very concerning for a lot of people. But and I think for us at least, what really and I'll speak personally for me, but the first exoneration that I saw, being there in that moment, seeing everybody that was there for family members, loved ones that were there, as well as everybody who worked on the case and everything else. Like,
which one was that? Which case?
Well, we were there for.
We've been there for now a couple, but the first one I think was. So Ruel, I think, was the first one.
Ruel,
Ruel.
Wow, Ruel.
Yeah.
Seller,
But seeing just
and
how
we drove there, and we were like outside waiting for him to come out from the different checkpoints when you get your stuff, and just the energy of the room, and as we're walking out of the building and then going to dinner with him and getting to talk to him, and it's just an energy that is unmatched. It's incredible.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it kind of to Jeff's point, it kind of brings those feelings again when we were looking at this film for Dean. People may say, oh, it's one person that was wrongfully convicted, one person that was exonerated. But when you see the energy and the history behind the suffering of that one person, plus their inner circle and the community, you realize the impact that a wrongful conviction can have, but also the work that OIP and the Innocence movement is having as a whole, which is
that's something that never leaves you. I mean, I and we were there for Miller too, and
that's right.
It's just, I don't know.
Yeah, so you think about I think anybody, even if they haven't seen that experience, can understand what a tragedy it would be to be wrongfully convicted and sentenced to life for something you didn't do. And think about in most other fields, if some catastrophic incident occurs, if you're at a hospital and somebody dies, right? They come in and there's an investigation. What went wrong? They might change their policies. Somebody during surgery dies. There's a full investigation about what went wrong. When a plane crashes, they come in with the federal agencies and do a full investigation. And then the justice system, we have planes crashing left and right, and nothing ever does.
And nothing ever changes.
There's no introspection. There's no we need to come in with objective people and do a study. It's unbelievable how insulated it is from market forces, and which really no other field or area is.
Yeah.
So it just keeps happening.
I think that's why, to your point, why awareness is so important. And if anything, it puts more pressure on politicians, judges, policymakers to change and make sure this doesn't happen. If the more people that, obviously look like they actually care about what's going on and are bothered by this, the more pressure it puts on these individuals to hopefully do something that's going to change it. So,
and speaking of change, so in your book, you talk about some methodologies that have been used and relied upon historically, law enforcement agencies and criminal investigators now have been discovered to be not even as close as reliable as they could be, or as they believe to be, what we call now the junk sciences, right? The advancement of technology, do you see anything in the horizon, a new technology being used or being proposed to be used? For example, there's been a lot of fuzz about facial recognition and how that might be used in criminal investigations. That either concerns you, or you may think, well, this may become the junk science in the future.
Sure. I mean, the problem is not new technology. New technology is great. It's just that we don't evaluate it properly. And so something comes in, everybody gets overexcited. They give it too much weight. It's not properly handled in the criminal justice system. And so typically results are overstated. I wrote an article called, She Blinded Me with Science. It's about, jurors, you come in and you bring all this fancy CSI sounding stuff and a lot of times they don't even question it. So it's hard. It's a problem with technology. Technology can be helpful if it's properly cabined and considered for what it actually is, not some like crystal ball that tells us the truth, like some oracle. And that the problem is us. The problem is that that's what we tend to do. We tend to just over rely on it. But yeah, I mean, as far as, we're talking about public awareness and public disconnect, we've got all these shows like CSI that make it seem like our forensic system is like some amazing miracle, like curing cancer. Yeah. Or like, putting man on Mars or something like that. Like, wow, it's just, and if the public knew really how problematic a lot of the so-called forensics are, it's really the opposite.
Yeah, which they'll know once we discuss that that piece of the book in the podcast to get it out there.
And
good.
Along those lines, why do you think there is so much resistance, especially among the federal agencies, the ATF, the FBI, CIA, as far as using? I mean, they still rely on like polygraphs. They still rely on like arson science that is largely junk science. Why do you think there's so much resistance? I mean, it's not that they don't know they're not reliable, right? Like, I mean, these are attorneys.
Man, I don't know. Like, it's frustrating how, the National Academy of Sciences came out with a report in 2009 that that's an independent agency that advises Congress on matters of science that was established by Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. And they did a multi-year investigation, and they issued a 500-page report about how flawed forensics are in this country. And, I'll give talks now to like judges who never heard of it.
It's just concerning.
And then like, I won't go into details, but I saw an email of a public defender's agency in another state. It got shared around among people I work with, where one of the public defenders used the National Academy of Science report to cross-examine an expert that the prosecution put on who was testifying to junk science. And so he was using it saying, well, this report found it was flawed, right? Blah, 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 blah. And so the head public defender sent out an email to all the public defenders saying like, hey, like Joey did a great job. He found this thing called the National Academy of Science report and he cross-examined the expert. He's a beast. Like, and it's like you're sending this email 10 years later, like he's just discovered some like. Yeah. It's like, why don't you know this the day after it came out?
Exactly.
Like, that's what's so frustrating.
Yeah, it's like that should be embarrassing.
It's embarrassing,
you're celebrating.
And that email was so embarrassing. Somebody in the Innocence Network got a hold of it, and then they sent it around to all of us. Like, look at this. Like, it takes so long for information to get disseminated. And part of it is because public defenders' offices are underfunded, and all these people got their nose to the grindstone. They don't have time to be introspective or like have the luxury of assigning people to stay on top of everybody and do all the trainings.
Right.
Yeah, you're definitely underfunded, and you have caseloads that are just, I mean, insane. I averaged about 120 when I was doing that, and wow. The problem is you're I mean, you're in court for so much that. Then you got to come back and find time to work on these cases.
Right.
It's not like you're just sitting in the office. Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you just get a file or you got to cover a case that you really had not much opportunity, if any, to look over. And it's like, then you're fighting judges trying to get a continuance because you're like, I can't effectively represent this person. I don't know anything about the case. And they're like, well, it's set for trial today. It's like, I don't know what to tell you because I'm not going forward on a case that, I don't know enough about to defend the person. But
and we had a judge when I was a prosecutor that would not give continuances like that. And the reason why he wouldn't is because he knew it would force people into a plea.
Yeah.
So like neither side's ready to go to trial. Both are saying like, what? Like, X, Y, and Z happened. We need more time. He's like, no, we're picking a jury now.
Yeah.
Call down, bring up a jury pool. And the attorneys are sitting there like, and so it's like, okay, well, we got to settle the case.
Yeah. And it's so screwed up because the judge is more concerned about their docket than actual justice or, what's actually going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned a little bit earlier in a conversation, that last step of the process, which is helping change the systems and in place and the mentality. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about how the work that OIP has done for the fight against wrongful convictions, even outside of the day-to-day, which is trying to get people exonerated, policy work, and changing the mentality, the awareness that then changes the mentality.
CIU, Conviction Integrity Unit.
Conviction Integrity Unit, yeah.
Yeah, so we've had several bills passed over the 20 years that reform the criminal justice system, make it less likely that we'll get wrongful convictions. So, for example, we had a DNA preservation bill where, they're required to save the DNA from a crime scene until the person's out of prison because the technology keeps advancing. So it might look like one where you can't do DNA testing and solve the case now, but in 10 years, if we go back to the same evidence, we can solve it. We have a bill that requires recording of interrogations so that there's a clear record about what happened in the interrogation room. It's not a he said, she said. I can go into that. I mean, as a prosecutor, I had my own instances of that where there wasn't a recording and everybody had a totally different memory of what happened in the interrogation room. But it also, it makes sure that the system's operating properly and cops are doing fair interrogations because they know they're being recorded. And not all cops are trying to cheat or coerce a confession out of people,
right.
But some do. And if they know they're being recorded, it's much less likely to do that. We had a bill that reformed eyewitness identification procedures that, and science shows that if you change the way police officers show photos, that you see on TV, like the 6-pack, they show 6 pictures to witnesses, and do you recognize the guy who did this? That process can be changed in a way that greatly reduces the chance that they'll pick the wrong person. And so we had a bill that, each one of these things I could talk about for half an hour to explain all the detail, how it works, right? Right now we're working on helping with the death penalty. There's an abolition movement in Ohio, but the next thing we're going to do is amend the DNA bill to make it we keep trying to go back and get it expanded further to make it easier to get DNA testing in prison. But it's a never-ending slate of issues. And I don't know if it's partially, I guess, because of our work, but also because of TV shows like Making a Murder and just there's a greater public awareness of the issue. So, when I first started doing this, nobody knew about this issue. And I tried to get a bill passed in 2003 and 2004, and I would talk with the representatives or senators, and the idea seemed very bizarre to them. Yeah. So it doesn't seem bizarre. Everybody's at least somewhat familiar with the concept that it happens. When I speak places, and I'll often ask, like, what do you think are the leading causes of wrongful conviction? Like, a good percentage of the population now understands it. And they'll say, like, eyewitness identification, false confessions. Like, so you can see the awareness happening to some degree. CIUs, you mentioned, conviction integrity units. They're a new thing where some prosecutors' offices will designate like an innocence project inside their office. And that's a double-edged sword. So if it's done right, it's far more effective than an innocence project because prosecutors have all the information, they have all the documents, they can show up at witness's house with a badge, and people will actually talk to them. So, and there's many places where it's done right, and they get tons of exoneration. I mean, unbelievable, way better than an innocence project when they do it right. But a lot of them are crinos, conviction integrity in name only. Conviction review in name only.
It's like PR optics.
It's a PR optics thing, and including the ones in Ohio. And so, like, the reality is, all it is prosecutors who are designated to fight everything we're doing. Yeah. So it's like we file a motion to free somebody. Our conviction integrity unit is the one that handles those cases, and then they fight us. On everything. It's like,
we already looked at that.
No, most of the time it's the first time they've heard of it, but they're just fighting us from the beginning. So there's nothing's changed. They're not actually.
It's just a specific task force to be dedicated to fight.
Instead of like randomly picking which prosecutor is going to fight against the Innocence Project.
Yeah, they just have some
designated
dedicated
people
for that.
Then they call that the conviction integrity unit. So we don't have any legitimate ones that are functioning in Ohio like the ones in Detroit or San Francisco or LA or Houston, Dallas, Brooklyn. There's a lot of really good ones. There's a center at Penn Law School called the Quattrone Center that studies procedural culture and reform and stuff like that. And they came out with a best practices guide for conviction integrity units. And I've seen the necessity of this, and person, because like one of the things they said is, you need to hire somebody who's not a lifelong prosecutor who can look at it differently.
Right.
Like go get the top defense attorney to run it. And then you have to politically insulate them. So if the defense attorney who's now a prosecutor comes in the office and says, I want the files for that case, they can actually get it. Because what I'm hearing, and I've got people I know that are in conviction integrity units, and they go and they try to, the prosecutor, and they said, we're going to look into this case, and they go, no. And they try to sabotage it, right? And they start like this internal warring inside the office. So it only works if it's like politically insulated, they actually have power. It's somebody who's not friends with the prosecutors, who's like, got an independence there.
Yeah.
But when it is set up that way, it's extremely effective.
Yeah. It sounds like it's really hard to get to that point, though, I guess. And I guess because there's still all the political pressure at play, and everything else that underlies the issue to begin with.
Well, we know you have things to do and places to be, so we want to be mindful of your time. Thank you for joining us. Yeah. Unless you have anything else, we would like to just remind everyone who is listening and everyone who's watching, Professor Godsey's book, Blind Injustice, is available. We got ours. I mean, we read ours when we were fellows, but we got this one from Amazon. We'll have the link in the description below, both the physical book and the audio book. We're going to be talking about this in breaking it down in other episodes. If you want to follow along, we definitely encourage you to buy it. Even if you don't want to follow along, it's a great read. So Blind Injustice by Professor Mark Godsey. Links are going to be in the description. Professor, thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hopefully
guys.
we'll see you soon.
All right, take care, man.
Thank you.